For thousands of years, we humans have been asking ourselves, what happens after death? The ancient Egyptians believed they had the answer. Once mummified, they would embark on a long and dangerous journey to an everlasting paradise. But to get there, they needed a guide with magic spells. The Book of the Dead. Travel back 3,500 years and follow the ancient Egyptians from death to what lies beyond in this once-in-a-lifetime exhibition. Journey through the afterlife, Ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, at the British Museum.
All right, so as we start talking about ancient Egyptian religion, one of the things that we have to understand is that Egyptian citizens lived their entire life in anticipation of their afterlife. So everything that they did in their life was dictated in some way with thinking about what would happen to them after they died. And so the actions that they took, the buildings that they built, the art that they created, all had some tie in some way to an afterlife or to their religion. And so that's one of the most important things to understand as we start talking about their polytheistic beliefs, is that yes, they were trying to guide how people behaved in their lifetime, but more importantly, how those choices would affect their afterlife. So, first of all, we have to understand that just like the most Mesopotamian cultures, Egyptians were polytheistic, meaning that they had many, many different gods. Another word for God is a deity, and so you'll see that term sometimes. And they, depending on where they lived or what time in history, there could have been as many as 2,000 different gods and goddesses. Now, that doesn't mean that every person, every day of their life, worshipped 2,000 gods. But when you consider that times, we're talking 2,000 years worth of history here, gods might have been more important in one region of Egypt than another, or one time in history than another. So when we say that there were 2,000 gods, we're talking about documentation over the course of studies of ancient Egypt. That's what has been uncovered. But there definitely were key gods that lasted throughout the whole time in history, except for one pharaoh, one leader, a man named Akhenaten, who was actually King Tut's father. Tutankhamun, you guys have probably heard about. Akhenaten changed the religion for a short amount of time while he was pharaoh, and he made the religion monotheistic, one God. And he said that he was that God, that was Aten, and he was Aten, Akhenaten, the God on earth. So during a small time in history, the Egyptians were monotheistic, and even though everyone knows who King Tut is, he didn't do much in his life because he didn't rule for very long. The only thing that is noted that he did of importance was he changed the religion back to a polytheistic belief. All right, so one of the things that is unique in the Egyptian culture is the way that most of their gods are shown in artwork. A lot of their gods are part animal and part person, so they often have the body of a person, the head of a god, like Horus. He's a hawk, but he has a human body. two of the main gods are actually all human, but they have an unusual color, blue or green. So Amun-Ra is kind of a combination. Amun was a very important god, Ra was a very important god, and later in history it was combined to be Amun-Ra, which is the sun god. You're going to see Amun-Ra shown here, like this blue guy, this blue character, or you'll just see Ra, and we'll see a picture of him in a little bit. And then Osiris, the green god, he is very, very important because he is the god of the underworld. Now, if you think of Hades in Greek mythology, he was also the god of the underworld. When we think of the underworld, we think of a very bad, dangerous, horrible, scary place with fire and torture and things like that. Most ancient cultures didn't believe that the afterlife or the underworld was horrible. Every person who died went there. Every person went to the underworld, and it was kind of just the next step. So when you think about Osiris, or later on when we study Greek culture, when you think about Hades, they're not evil characters doing torture to the people who die. It's very different than modern thought. Here are some other important gods. So Horus, as I said, he was the god of the sky, and he protected Egypt. When a man became pharaoh, he was considered the living Horus. So Horus had an embodiment on earth, and that was the pharaoh. So pharaohs were worshipped as a god. So they were the leader of the politics, the government, but they were also the leader of the religion and took on a godlike image to the people. That's got a special name. That kind of government has a special name. And that is theocracy. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we study the politics of Egypt. Isis is a woman. She was a goddess, and she is Horus's mother. So she was pretty important because, she would have been considered the pharaoh's spiritual mother, so to speak. And then she was married to Osiris, the god of the dead. So she's pretty important in the family tree of gods and goddesses in Egypt. Anubis, I find Anubis very interesting. He is the god of the dead. So he's different than Osiris. Osiris is the god of the underworld, the place. Anubis is the god of the people, the dead, and the process of preserving those bodies. And he has the head of a jackal. Now, this makes total sense when you think about what the Egyptian people would see every day. A jackal lived in ancient Egypt as an animal, and it's a scrounger. And it is an animal that would eat the remains of things that have died in the desert. So it makes sense that if you're burying people under the sand because they didn't always embalm, or if they did, they didn't always bury people in big fancy tombs. Sometimes they were just buried in the sand, and the jackals would kind of hang around there. So the Egyptian people saw these animals hanging out, wandering around in the cemetery where the people were died, and they thought, oh, look, they're protecting. And so that makes sense that Anubis would have the head of that animal because the Egyptians saw that as an animal protecting the dead. And then Ra, here's that image I told you. Amun-Ra originally was just Ra, and he's the sun god, and he usually has that disc on his head. And he also has a bird head, kind of like Horus does. Horus is a hawk, and I think Ra, I'm not sure what Ra is. But, so he is the sun god. When we think of religion, a lot of times we think about going to church on Sunday and sitting and listening to someone, teach us stories or give us lessons on, the past and the religions and the gods and the people who lived during those ancient times, and then helping us know this is how you should behave. Well, in ancient Egypt, they didn't have churches. They had temples. And these temples weren't for people to go to worship. As a matter of fact, priests were the only people allowed to go in a temple. But this was a place where it was believed that the gods lived. This was their place on earth. And so people would bring offerings like food, um, grains and things like that offered to the gods, to thank them for their kindness, to thank them for taking care of them. Kind of like when, if you've ever gone to church and they pass around the plate and you put money in there, that offering that you give, well, that money is nowadays it helps the church to run. But in ancient times, you still gave offerings, but what you were giving was the items that had importance to you, food items and things like that. And you were sacrificing or giving those things, to thank the gods. So it has translated to the modern world, but we just use that offering in a different way in today's society. So these temples would have been built in every single city, and there would have been a lot of them because each temple would have been to honor a different god. Um, and this was where you could go if you needed to ask for a favor or ask for something, to help you in your life if you needed a god's assistance. And as I said, priests were the only ones that could go into those places, those temples. But priests had lots of jobs. Their main job was to care for the gods. And so they did. They brought offerings very regularly to those temples and things like that. As far as how did priests affect the everyday people, they taught school. They supervised. They helped people with their problems. So a lot of what priests and ministers do in our world today, giving us advice, helping us through our problems, teaching us lessons to help us be better people, and sometimes helping in funerals and things like that, and also in some cases teaching schools like Sunday school or even private schools. Sometimes priests are teachers there. So it's very similar to what the priests did in ancient Egypt. However, there was a small group of people that were also responsible for taking a person after they had passed away and preparing them for that afterlife that we said was so very, very important to the ancient Egyptians. And so there were some groups of priests that their responsibility was to prepare the dead for mummification, for the afterlife. Now, the Egyptians saw death as a transition. It wasn't something necessarily to be feared because they believed that there was a better life in the next world and that that was the way they could achieve their best life, their best potential. And that they had parts of them that would survive after death. And those parts were called the Ka, the Ba, and the Ak. And only some people had the Ak, which I'll explain in a minute. So these three souls, when we think about our soul, we don't think about it having parts. We just talk about, that there's a part of us that, some people believe that their soul will go to an afterlife. Some religions still teach that today. Some religions believe that the soul has lived through many lives and has passed on from one person to another. So those ideas still exist in lots of religions today. But the Egyptians were unique in that they thought the soul had parts, and each part had a different job. So the Ka, sometimes shown as those two hands, sometimes shown as those two hands with a body attached to it. But this was basically your, for want of a better word, your ghost. It looks just like you. It's basically your double. But this Ka had to have a place that it could live after it died. So it needed to be able to recognize the body. So this Ka and the Ba also are the reasons why the Egyptians mummified their dead. Because if the Ka couldn't find its home, its host, its body, then it would perish and it wouldn't have an afterlife. So to preserve those bodies and make them last as long as possible meant that the Ka could live on, because you needed the Ka and the Ba to be reunited, which took some time. It didn't just happen as soon as you passed away. Um, you needed that time, and if they never got reunited, then that soul, that person, never went to the afterlife. So having some place that the Ka could live was very important. And the best place for that Ka to survive would be in the body of the person who had died, because it looked just like the Ka. And they believed that the Ka needed things to survive in the next life. So people were buried with items, people were buried with food, people were buried with servants, sometimes in early times. In later times, they just made statues of servants to be buried with the person so that it represented people that could help them in the next life. They were left with toys, they were left with games, they were left with furniture. Um, there has been grain, buckets of grain and remnants of beer. Yep, the Egyptians made beer, guys. Um, Buried with people. And so anything that they could imagine that you might need in your next life were often buried with people, depending on what you had in your life. So obviously, richer people had more things that they were buried with. Now the Ba has the head of a person and the body of a bird, and the Ba can leave the soul and can leave the tomb and travel the world and interact with the living. And so it needs to be able to find the body when it comes back home again. So again, that same idea of being able to recognize the person to return home. Now, the idea of the Ba changed over time. Originally, only the pharaoh had a Ba, but later on they believed that everybody did, and they still required food and things like that to survive. Now, the Ak is a fairly new concept to me. Most history books don't teach about the Ak. And I guess that's because not everybody had an Ak. An Ak was only for the very, very best people. So, for example, a criminal, they they weren't expected to have an afterlife. They had lived too horrible of a life, so they were never expected to survive. They wouldn't have an Ak. And what's unique about the Ak is it could change things in the living world. So it was kind of able to interact with and affect people that were still living. So that's kind of an interesting concept. But again, the Ak also needed to be able to come back to the body after it had traveled a bit. All of these things could die, and like I said, that's why the mummification process happened. Early on, the Egyptians realized that they were burying their dead and as we talk about the mummification process in a bit, you'll understand a little bit better. But originally, they didn't bury them in big temples and tombs and things like that. They buried them in the ground. But they realized that the body didn't last forever. And so if your body perished before the souls had moved on, you experienced what was called second death. And second death was horrible. It was like the worst thing that could happen to your soul. And so the Egyptians worked very, very hard, especially for people of importance like the pharaoh, more than anything else, to assure that the Ba and the Ka and the Ak had a place to reside after death. And so if it wasn't the actual body, as long as it looked like the person, the Ba and the Ka and the Ak could live there. So they made statues of the pharaohs everywhere, spread throughout the whole country. They made paintings. They made something called a cartouche, and that's what this gold oval is. That's called a cartouche, and in that cartouche is the name of a pharaoh written in hieroglyphs. So you read that from top to bottom. And I'm not sure who this is. We'd have to research the symbols to figure out whose cartouche this is. But a Ba and a Ka could essentially live in any of those things. So if something happened to the mummy, They could reside in a statue that had the face of the person who had died, or a painting that had the face, or even a cartouche that had their name. So that's why so many of the artwork of these people were dictated to be about their death, essentially, because they wanted to create many, many options for the ba and the ka. And actually, a way to affect or even punish someone would be to destroy those things. So if you look at these statues, notice how their faces have been obliterated. They've kind of been chipped away or carved away. There is a pharaoh, which we'll talk about when we discuss the different leaders of Egypt, who took over without really having permission to lead. And when she died, yep, it was a woman. We'll talk about her later. But when she died, her stepson, the person who was supposed to have been in charge all this time, he ordered her statues and her likeness to be destroyed. And so he tried very, very hard to destroy any possibility of her Ba and Ka surviving. And so that was actually a way that you could punish someone, was by destroying anything so that their Ba and the Ka had nowhere to go. All right, so we're going to stop here. That's talking more about the religion. And then I'm going to come back with part 2, talking about mummification and how mummification, how that took place. All right, so we will